There is a higher law than the law of government. That's the law of conscience. Stokely Carmichael.
Oh, hi! Mr. Lahasky here, and today we'll examine the modern civil rights movement, which culminated with major legislation in the 1960s. You'll remember that in pursuit of his great society, Lyndon B. Johnson directed his administration to attack racial injustice. And during Johnson's presidency, Congress passed a number of landmark laws that effectively brought the Jim Crow era to an end. But the civil rights laws of 1964, 1965, and 1968 were actually the product of a much larger movement, one that had been building in the public eye for decades, but also one that had existed for centuries. Today, we'll attempt to situate the civil rights movement in its proper context. But first, as we always do, let's ask a big question. Is nonviolence the best way to effect meaningful change? Martin Luther King Jr. is widely celebrated as the hero of the modern civil rights movement. At his urging, Black activists across the country adopted the strategy of nonviolence in pursuit of their goals. Their commitment to nonviolence also produced some of the most visceral moments of the entire movement, including the defiant arrest of Rosa Parks, the dramatic scene on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, and the famous 1963 March on Washington. But while King's approach was ultimately adopted by Black America, it was not the only civil rights strategy. Division within the Black community produced fierce debate over the merits of nonviolence. And given the civil rights movement's contemporary refrain, now may be a pertinent time to revisit the 1960s. Was nonviolence the key to the civil rights victories, or did it leave too much on the table? Let's take a look. Our first big idea traces the origins of the civil rights movement to its beginnings, its real beginnings. Ever since the first enslaved Africans arrived on the shore of Virginia in the 17th century, Black people in America have fought for and have largely been denied liberty and dignity. According to many American history textbooks, the civil rights movement began in the 1950s and concluded in the 1960s. But this conventional telling of the story is misleading. Rather, civil rights activities in the mid-1900s represent a new chapter in a centuries-old story, one that began in the colonial era. When the first enslaved Africans landed at Point Comfort, Virginia in 1619, there was little that distinguished them from white indentured servants. However, by the mid-1600s, changing economic and political conditions in the Chesapeake, along with the colonists' tendencies towards racism, gave rise to slave codes, which systematically dehumanized the enslaved by stripping them of basic freedoms and rights. They created a racial caste system that would endure for more than 200 years. Still, enslaved people resisted this condition through covert methods like fictive kinship and the preservation of their culture, and through overt methods like work slowdowns and slave revolts. Believing that the Revolutionary War would bring liberty to America, thousands of African Americans served as patriots. But after independence was won, they saw slavery codified in state constitutions across the South. Meanwhile, the federal constitution and the federal government ignored the issue altogether. During the 19th century, resistance to slavery intensified with an abolitionist movement that began during the Second Great Awakening. Black leaders like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth demanded freedom for their people and succeeded in winning many white Northerners for their cause. By the Civil War's third year, the injustice of slavery took center stage, and nearly 200,000 Black people joined the Union ranks to achieve the promise of freedom. Their efforts yielded monumental gains, at least on paper. The Civil War amendments ended slavery and rendered African Americans equal citizens in the eyes of federal law. But you'll recall that the reality was far more sobering. White supremacists in the South rallied against Blacks during Reconstruction. They established Black codes that restricted the economic and political freedoms of African Americans. Sharecroppers were forced to live as wards of the white landowning class, and people of color were systematically denied the elective franchise through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other illicit forms of intimidation. In the preceding decades, Jim Crow laws segregated the South. a movement that was legitimized by the Supreme Court in the disastrous Plessy decision. Near the turn of the 20th century, a new generation of black leaders emerged. Booker T. Washington maintained that people of color could earn the respect of whites through work and economic advancement. He was wrong. During the Progressive Era, W.E.B. Du Bois implored African Americans to demand their civil liberties. But while the progressives successfully reformed many injustices of the Gilded Age, racism and segregation were largely ignored. In the South, lynchings accelerated, and Ida B. Wells' efforts to push federal anti-lynching legislation were blocked by white redeemers in Congress. During World War I and World War II, American presidents insisted that freedom and democracy were at stake. Despite the fact that African Americans had never fully experienced those ideals, they signed up and served with valor, often in segregated units. After the war, black veterans were denied benefits promised to them by the GI Bill. While members of the white middle class built generational wealth in the suburbs, people of color were systematically excluded from desirable neighborhoods and left in neglected rentals in urban centers. But the calls for equality continued, and by the late 40s and early 50s, it was time for a new generation of black activists and advocates. The early stages of the modern civil rights movement are laid out in our second big idea. Modest groundwork for civil rights was achieved after World War II, but the modern civil rights movement began in earnest with the pivotal Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. During World War II, African Americans had rallied around the Double V campaign, a slogan for victory over the enemies of freedom, both overseas and at home. And America's victory in World War II did lead to a wider embrace of American ideals, long held but never lived up to. It may have all started in 1947 when a young man named Jackie Roosevelt Robinson became the first man to break Major League Baseball's color barrier. That year, he took the sport by storm, and despite the fact that he faced harsh discrimination on the road and was paid markedly less than his white teammates, he inspired a generation of black kids and their parents. The following year, President Truman issued the first civil rights executive order, when he prohibited the military from discriminating based on race, paving the way for full integration of the armed forces in the 1950s. But the turning point for the modern civil rights movement came in 1954, when the Supreme Court righted a decision that had long cast a shadow on the Jim Crow South. 3 years earlier, in 1951, a black Kansas man named Oliver Brown filed a lawsuit against the Topeka Board of Education, after the board denied his daughter admission to an all-white elementary school. Brown was represented by Thurgood Marshall, the head of the NAACP's legal division. Marshall argued that black schools and other facilities were inherently unequal, violating the 14th Amendment and invalidating Plessy v. Ferguson. And the court agreed. The ruling in Brown v. Board overturned the damaging Plessy case and ended segregation in schools, at least on paper. The struggle to actually integrate public schools played out for more than a decade. But thanks to the Brown ruling, the integration movement had the weight of the Supreme Court behind it. The Brown ruling helped to open the floodgates for civil rights movements across the country, paving the way for Martin Luther King's push for national legislation. But it also enraged segregationists in the South, and white resistance mounted. This is our third big idea. Tensions between white and black Americans escalated in the 1950s and 60s, as African American leaders increased their calls for civil rights. Their demands centered around the unfulfilled promises of the Reconstruction Amendments, and their efforts yielded major legislation in the mid-1960s. The ruling in Brown v. Board effectively made segregation illegal. But as we've discussed a number of times throughout this story, laws are only effective to the extent that they are enforced. And facing fundamental changes to the social fabric, white Southerners resisted such enforcement, defiantly and violently. In August 1955, this defiance adorned national headlines when a 14-year-old from Chicago named Emmett Till was brutally lynched while visiting family in Money, Mississippi. Till's funeral was attended by members of Chicago's black press, and his mother insisted on an open casket so the world would know the cruelty of her son's death. Back in Mississippi, Till's assailants were acquitted by an all-white jury, adding another name to the long list of lynching victims who were denied justice even in death. Emmett Till's story, while perhaps not a surprise to Black Southerners for whom Jim Crow was a grotesque reality, did embolden Black activists to take action against their daily injustices. On December 1st, 1955, a 42-year-old woman named Rosa Parks refused to yield her seat to a white man on a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. The small act of protest landed Parks in jail, but it also inspired the Black community in Montgomery to rally behind her cause. 4 days later, a Baptist preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to a crowd in Montgomery, announcing a boycott of public transportation in the city. In this speech, he laid out the case for nonviolence, the strategy that would define his movement. He said, "I want to say that we are not here advocating violence. The only weapon that we have in our hands this evening is the weapon of protest. The great glory of American democracy is the right to protest for right. My friends, don't let anybody make us feel we are to be compared in our actions with the Ku Klux Klan or with the White Citizens Council. There will be no crosses burned at any bus stops in Montgomery. There will be no white persons pulled out of their homes and taken out on some distant road and lynched for not cooperating. There will be nobody among us who will stand up and defy the Constitution of this nation. We only assemble here because of our desires to see right exist. And we are not wrong. We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. Love has no meaning. And we are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." While perhaps not as famous as King's later speeches, this one is no less important. King insisted that the rights for which the Black community were protesting were not radical, that they sought no special treatment, only the dignity guaranteed by the Constitution and more recently the Supreme Court, the dignity that had long been denied to people of color in the South. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days, after which the city of Montgomery officially integrated the public transit system and business resumed as normal. But elsewhere, integration met stauncher resistance. Often, white opposition was fiercest against integration of schools. In 1957, 9 Black teenagers were denied entrance to Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, after the segregationist governor of that state ordered the Arkansas National Guard to block the school doors. Protesters harassed the students, known to posterity as the Little Rock Nine. As the students were turned away, white onlookers threatened them with violence. President Eisenhower was forced to intervene, sending federal troops to Little Rock and ordering the state guard to stand down. But of course, Arkansas was not the only place that resisted integration. 10 years after the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board, only 2% of Black school children were sharing classrooms with whites. The process required federal intervention on multiple occasions. In 1962, James Meredith became the first Black student enrolled at the University of Mississippi. But President Kennedy was forced to deploy the U.S. Army to Oxford when segregationists on campus instigated a riot over Meredith's presence. The following year, Alabama Governor George Wallace promised to stand in the schoolhouse door and personally block the enrollment of 2 African American students at the University of Alabama, forcing Kennedy again to mobilize troops to enforce the Supreme Court's order. At each turn, the pioneering students faced threats of violence and other acts of intimidation. And at each turn, they proceeded bravely, without retaliating, gradually earning more favor with the American public. By the early 1960s, Martin Luther King's movement had grown. His followers staged boycotts, sit-ins, and marches across the South, and most adhered to his principles of nonviolence, though their white opponents did not always respond in kind. Birmingham, Alabama, notorious for being one of the most segregated and most racist cities in America, was the focus of King's protests in April of 1963. But demonstrations there were met with violence when police turned canine units and fire hoses against the protesters. King was arrested and jailed for a week, while video footage of the action in Birmingham disturbed Americans nationwide, paving the way for a massive demonstration in Washington, D.C. In August 1963, more than 250,000 protesters descended on the nation's capital, where King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. But contrary to popular memory, the demonstration in Washington was not wholly unifying. King's opponents called his ideas radical, and the FBI constantly looked for ways to undermine his influence, resorting even to blackmail. Polling shows that less than half of all Americans favored MLK at the time of the March on Washington, and violence against his movement continued. Only a month after the march, white supremacists in Birmingham detonated a bomb inside the historically black 16th Street Baptist Church, a rallying point for civil rights activity. 4 young girls preparing for Sunday services were killed in the attack, and more than 20 were injured, sparking more protests in Birmingham and national outrage. The Birmingham bombing was but one example in a long list of violent actions by whites in the South who resisted the desegregation efforts. Nationally, however, momentum was growing, as was the public appetite for meaningful change. Less than a year after the bombing, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, affirming the Brown ruling and bringing a legislative end to the Jim Crow era. But the 1964 Act did little to end the disenfranchisement of black voters, which had plagued the South since Reconstruction. Activists turned their attention to voting rights, and another Alabama town took center stage: Selma. An organization known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, led by 25-year-old activist John Lewis, began working to register black voters in Selma in January of 1965. But their efforts were largely blocked by white officials. Hundreds were arrested in the ensuing protests, including Dr. King, who had come to Selma to back the efforts of the SNCC. After a black activist named Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed by police during a protest in the nearby town of Marion, Lewis organized a march from Selma, Alabama, to the capital city of Montgomery. The 54-mile trek was intended to show the segregationist governor, George Wallace, that the black community would no longer stand for their maltreatment and disenfranchisement. But when Lewis and 600 of his followers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge heading out of Selma on March 7th, they were met by hundreds of Alabama state troopers, armed with nightsticks. Lewis and the marchers stopped advancing but stood their ground, and then, unprovoked, the troopers attacked. Lewis and dozens of others were pushed to the ground and beaten, while white onlookers waved Confederate flags and cheered on the police. The ordeal was captured on video and appeared on national networks late that night, to the horror of Americans across the country. Many flocked to Selma, where 2 weeks after the attack, Lewis, King, and 25,000 others successfully completed the 5-day march to Montgomery under the protection of federal troops. The events in Selma inspired President Johnson, who, amid the controversy, gave a televised speech in support of Lewis, his movement, and voting rights for African Americans. On March 17th, the Voting Rights Act was introduced in Congress. LBJ signed it on August 6, 1965. The landmark law ended literacy tests, which had long been used as a tool to disenfranchise people of color. It removed barriers to black voter registration, and it led to a massive increase in black voter participation in the years that followed. Indeed, MLK's nonviolent movement was instrumental in the passing of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 65. But this is not where the story ends. The decline of Martin Luther King and the rise of a new movement are the subject of our fourth big idea. Following the legislative victories of the mid-1960s, Martin Luther King turned his attention to economic inequality, which the Civil Rights Acts had failed to address. However, these efforts lost favor among whites and blacks for various reasons. After King's assassination in 1968, a more militant Black Power movement emerged. It's difficult to overstate the significance of the civil rights legislation that arose from Dr. King's movement. Like the Reconstruction Amendments, they provided the legal basis for the freedoms that Black people had long been denied. However, like the Reconstruction Amendments, they did very little to address the systemic economic inequality between whites and Blacks. In 1963, white families, on average, were more than 7 times wealthier than Black families. The average income for people of color was significantly lower, and African Americans lagged behind in key wealth-building metrics like home ownership. And we should remember that this inequality stems directly from the conditions imposed on African Americans after the Civil War. While they had been freed from slavery by the 13th Amendment, white planters maintained control of the land, forcing freedmen into sharecropping arrangements that perpetuated poverty in Black communities. Well into the 20th century, banks refused to provide loans to people of color, and they were zoned out of suburban neighborhoods through redlining. Dr. King recognized that the cycle of economic inequality was likely to continue absent government intervention, and he began advocating for action to this end. But this is when King began to lose favor, especially with white Americans. King actively supported organized labor and spoke out against the war in Vietnam, leading to accusations from government officials that King was a communist. MLK also went on record endorsing a $50 billion federal aid program for African Americans, but white America had little interest in investing that kind of money in the Black community. As a consolation, Congress did pass the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that was supposed to end discriminatory housing practices. But at the end of the day, very little was done to address the economic woes of Black America. Meanwhile, a younger generation of African Americans, recognizing the lack of progress, began to grow tired of King's nonviolence strategy. Rather than protest and wait patiently to be integrated into white society, they favored a separatist approach, one that emphasized Black autonomy and independence. The principles of this Black Power movement trace back to Marcus Garvey and the Harlem Renaissance, and in the 1960s they were championed by Malcolm X and then later Stokely Carmichael. Carmichael and his followers embraced the idea that Blacks should pursue their freedom and empowerment by any means necessary, even violence. Though Dr. King himself never wavered in his commitment to nonviolence, King's 1968 assassination mobilized thousands of young African Americans to the Black Power movement. In the wake of King's death, riots erupted in more than 100 U.S. cities. By 1970, the militant Black Panther Party was leading the Black Power movement. Now, the Panthers did make important strides in Black communities. Local chapters, often led by women, invested time and money in Black schools and legal aid programs. They distributed food, clothing, and other essential goods within the community, and even opened health clinics. But the Panthers' hostile rhetoric, especially towards police, rendered them a radical organizations in the minds of white mainstream society. The Black Power movement endured through much of the 1970s, but the public appetite for major legislation in support of the Black community fizzled. And many unaddressed issues of the 1960s and 70s, like economic inequality, police brutality, and inequities in education, are still with us today. And in the 50-plus years since the Civil Rights Movement, new issues have headlined civil rights undertakings, mass incarceration, as well as inequities in nutrition and medical care. And all this brings us back to our big question about the efficacy of nonviolence. On one hand, MLK's strategy was slow-moving. It took planning, persistence, and a lot of patience. And when it finally yielded fruit, the changes weren't revolutionary, but they were meaningful. The anti-discrimination legislation of the Civil Rights era transformed the South. Perhaps not completely, but it was a transformation nonetheless. And from a larger perspective, the heroism of King and those who shared in his movement is truly something to marvel at. To be faced with such unthinkable oppression and violence, and to look it in the face without so much as a clenched fist, that is the type of strength that has the ability to inspire millions. And in the 1960s, it did. And who knows, maybe we'll yet finish the work that they helped to continue after hundreds of years of struggles. Next time, we'll take a closer look at the 1970s. See you then.